I'm going to be talking to Max Fawcett, who's written a very, very good essay critiquing a Canadian economist who is arguing in his blog that there is no energy transition. And why this is important is because this is really how a lot of the political and business class in Canada views the transition, and it's totally incorrect. Max does a great job of debunking it. So, Max, welcome to the interview.
Thanks for having me on.
Look, before we get into the points of Don Wright's blog post, now tell us who Don is.
So he used to be the I'm trying to figure grasping for the correct term here, but basically the senior public servant in British Columbia under John Horgan. So deputy minister of deputy ministers, head of the executive council. Long career in public service, very smart guy, is a fellow with the C.D. Howe Institute, a fellow with, there's another one that escapes me right now, but, another meaningful thought leadership institution. He is not a partner, but a counsel with Global Public Affairs. So he's one of these like very established, very respected guys. He has a background in, he worked for, I think he was a CEO of a credit union in BC. He has worked in the financial sector. He has a PhD from Harvard. I started off my Substack post by saying that I often, sometimes get criticized for punching down when I'm, pointing out flaws in people's arguments about the energy transition. And so in this case, I decided to punch up. It doesn't get much more up than someone like Don Wright.
The reason I was interested in your post, aside from the fact that it was well argued, and I agreed with it because it's based on data and a lot of the thinkers that inform my worldview on the energy transition, but it's because Wright really symbolizes the energy conversation in Canada. I can't tell you how many times I've run across older academics, engineers, civil servants, whoever they are, and their arguments against the energy transition or the speed of the energy transition are incredibly flimsy. And when I go out and I interview experts in the US or Europe or Asia, the conversation there is so much more robust, so much more, they're plugged into the latest analysis, the latest data, the latest concepts. You've talked to people like Kingsmill Bond for Ember Energy. Would you agree that the Canadian energy discourse is really lacking?
Yes, deeply. I think part of it is, and I'm not someone who thinks we live in a petro state, but we live in a country whose economy is very heavily influenced by oil and gas. And I think that shapes the thinking and the conversation among people like Don Wright, who are, not directly involved in the fossil fuel industry, but certainly involved in adjacent ones. I'm sure they have investments in stocks, oil and gas stocks, banking stocks that hold oil and gas investments. There's just kind of a culture here of wanting to believe that the energy transition is not going to be disruptive, because if it's disruptive, then it disrupts them personally. I think Great Britain is sort of the opposite of that because it doesn't have a fossil fuel industry that dominates its economy. So it is able to think these things through, I think, a little more impartially. Same goes for Europe. The United States is kind of a mix. It obviously has a large fossil fuel lobby, large industry there, but it also has a large community of people who are independent thinkers, who are in the renewables space. There's sort of a conflict of ideas there, and America at its best, and it's obviously not at its best right now, but I think at its best, it has a much richer and more robust intellectual culture than we do here in Canada. And I think that's sort of reflected in how we talk about the energy transition, where most of the time we're talking about pipelines as though like that's the most important issue, that's the most important thing we could be talking about, when it's like 50th in what we really should be focused on.
I had that come up in an interview I did recently with Jigger Shaw. And you know who Jigger Shaw is because Jigger
Hmm.
Shaw has been around the American renewable sector for 25, 30 years. I mean, he's a veteran. He's been in the capital markets. He's led Sun Edison. But he was chosen by President Joe Biden in January of 2021 to head up the Department of Energy's loan program. And he had like 40 or $50 billion. But more than that, he was an evangelist for clean energy. He would go all over the country helping organizing and spreading this message. And I interviewed him. In fact, I did 5 shorter interviews, and the first 2 ran, and very few people watched it because the feedback was, "Who's Jigger Shaw?" We just don't know. I mean, these are superstars in the clean energy world that you and I live in. And in Canada, they haven't got a clue who they are. And same Kingsmill Bond and Dan Walter. And I mean, these are well-known folks in the analysis or in the academic world, whatever. And we just don't know them. And I think this is a big problem for us now as we go into this debate about which major projects the federal government should promote. And we're in the same old we're talking pipelines, we're talking LNG, we're talking the same old things we've always talked about.
Yeah, this is people who know me know this is a familiar frustration for me, specifically with the Alberta NDP, but progressives more broadly, which is that they have not done the work required to socialize the conversation we need to be having. They have not brought these people in. They have not brought their thinking in and exposed people to different ways of thinking about energy, talking about energy, and understanding where the threats and opportunities lie. And then you get to a situation where Naheed Nenshi, and I'm going to get into this in a column in the next little while, but Naheed Nenshi comes out and basically criticizes Danielle Smith's pipeline announcement for not being pipeliney enough, right? And it's like, no, dude, that is not your space. That is not where you're going to win. But they have not done the work of, I don't want to say educating, but sort of socializing this conversation about the energy transition such that more people are interested in it, aware of it, engaged in it, so that then they can turn it into a political advantage for themselves. More people should know who Jigger Shaw is because what he was doing was really important and will continue to be even after the Trump administration tries to wreck most of his work. So again, like we can talk about pipelines, but they're not that important. The things that are important are upstream and downstream from whether or not we build another pipeline to Pacific Tidewater. And it's sort of frustrating that we burn so much political capital here in Alberta and federally on a subject that it just isn't as important as it's made out to be.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. And one of the reasons why we have the conversation we do is because the Alberta oil and gas industry's narrative machine is massive and has been for a long time. It's dominated the national media. It dominates on Bay Street. It was interesting. About 4 years ago, I interviewed an analyst at one of the, I don't know, Bay Street investment houses, and she gave me back cap talking points almost word for word. Then
Sure.
Cap went in, did a presentation to her firm, and that's what she knows about the energy industry and what she tells her investors. And I think that story illustrates where a lot of our politicians and our policymakers and our business people get their information is from narratives that come out of the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And conservatives for decades now have complained that the mainstream media is biased against them, and there's like 10% truth to that and 90% bullshit. But what it did is it forced them to go out with the aid of technology, and we have all these obviously amazing technologies around social media is not amazing, but podcasts and YouTube, and we have all these new ways to get information into people's hands and heads. And progressives didn't really do anything there. They just sort of assumed that the advantage they had because the mainstream media covered them and their stories, I think a little more, I don't want to say honestly, but the media narrative hewed more closely to the progressive agenda because progressives tended to use facts and spoke the truth. And they assumed that that would be the case in social media, and it's not. Conservatives went out and they built these machines, right? They funded astroturf groups, they built media organizations, they threw millions of dollars at people to create these basically alternative realities, but realities that are incredibly effective at spreading their narrative, their story, their talking points. There's no journalistic integrity. There's no pushback. It's just what, yes, boss, what do you need me to say? You see it most egregiously with some of the content creators in the States who took money from the Russians. But that's happening on a smaller scale all over the place. And progressives, like you can see it now, they're starting to wake up to it, especially in the States. There's certainly a lot of, whether it's Pod Save America, whether it's the Bulwark, there are groups that are doing their best to create their own alternatives, but they're a decade behind. And nowhere is that more true than when it comes to oil and gas and energy, right? The guys in the oil and gas space and their proxies and their patrons are incredibly practiced at getting narratives out. And it takes a lot of effort to debunk a narrative, right? It's much easier to get your own narrative out there rather than trying to complicate, criticize, fact check someone else's. And yet that's the position that folks like me are always in, where we have to put our hand up and say, hold on, whoa, hold on. None of this is true, right? Or very little of it is true. And that's why in a lot of respects we're losing this sort of war for the conversation around climate policy.
That's a good place to jump into this conversation about Don Wright's piece, or two pieces actually. So there was four or five points that I pulled out of your essay about, critiquing his. And the first one is that there's never been an energy transition. And this came out of, Daniel Yergin, who's very famous, he started IHS Market and wrote a paper basically arguing this. And people like Michael Lieberich have jumped in and rebutted it, and Kingsmill Bond did the same thing. And so what was your rebuttal to Wright?
Well, it wasn't even mine. It was Ted Nordhaus, who is, a self-identified member of the hard-headed climate realist community. So, someone who I think would consider himself a lot like Don Wright, not a radical, not a climate exaggerationist, someone who believes in markets, believes in sort of physical sciences, and he says this whole argument is nonsense, that there's never been an energy transition because you're only looking at in terms of like the actual amount of energy provided by each technology and not its market share, not its proportion. So, the argument that Wright and Jurgen are making is we're using the same amount of biomass as we used 50 years ago. And then the counterpoint, again, coming from Ted Nordhaus, not me, is right, but as a percentage of the overall share of energy, it's gone down precipitously, right? Like the chart that they use is kind of a chart crime, right? Like it purports to say one thing, but if you actually look at the underlying context, it says something very different. And of course, there have been a bunch of energy transitions over the course of human civilization. You look at the trends in marine power. You look at the way we used to travel by boat. You look at the movement from being powered by animals to being powered by machines. Like there have been a bunch of energy transitions, but it's one of those things, one of those talking points that sounds superficially right, maybe, and then you have one chart and you go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And for folks like Don Wright, and I think older folks, right, who are not as interested in seeing things get disrupted, it makes them feel good because it says to them, okay, things aren't going to get crazy here. Like this whole energy transition is overblown. Yeah, we'll change a little bit at the margins, but things will mostly remain the same because they don't want to see things turned upside down. Unfortunately, I don't think that the actual data supports that.
I would agree wholeheartedly. And one of the points that gets missed a lot and is kind of emerged from the interviews I've been doing in the last 3, 4 months is that a lot of the people like Wright are arguing about the supply of energy. So they're talking about, well, we have oil and gas and coal and hydro and nuclear, and then now we've got wind and solar and batteries, and that'll just get tossed into the growing demand, and nothing is ever going to change. Not realizing that the really fundamental change here is on the demand side. We now have devices that can use electricity and do work better and more efficiently than we've never had before. Yeah, sure, we had an electric car 125 years ago, but it used a lead acid battery. So it didn't win the competition with the internal combustion engine. And we've had electric furnaces, but they're really inefficient and costly and nobody wanted to use them. Well, now we have electric vehicles, EVs, and we have heat pumps, which are incredibly efficient and low cost and provide all sorts of other benefits that people really like. And it's the demand side, and this is the genius of China. And I'm not suggesting we should turn into China. I get that all the time. Is that they not only scaled up the manufacture of the technologies on the supply side, they did the same thing for the demand side and then deployed them at scale. And so now, 60% of their sales of vehicles are EVs, yeah, et cetera, et cetera. So I agree with you entirely on it. But let's go to the next one, which is that the poorer countries still have to catch up, which basically, this is the OPEC's argument, by the way.
Yep.
That the global south is going to drive fossil fuel use because it's the cheapest way and they got lots of it, and so they're not going to do that. What's your rebuttal?
I find this argument so revealing in a lot of ways because it is a combination of arrogance and bigotry. It's arrogant because it presumes, well, we did it this way, we in the West, who are, of course, the best. And so everyone else in the world, when they get around to, the West's way, they'll have to do it the same way, right? I mean, that's just the way the world works. They're going to want to do things the way we did them because we're so smart and so wise. And that's just, we see that with phones, for example. They didn't roll out landlines in Africa and Southeast Asia. That they didn't go through the stations of the cross of technology the way we did. They just looked around and said, landlines seem kind of inefficient. Mobile phones are cheaper and better. We'll do that. We'll do the mobile. We're going to skip your dumb step and go straight to, we're going to pass go, right? Collect $200. And it's going to be the same with electricity, with energy. Like, why would they purchase expensive fossil fuel vehicles where the price of gas fluctuates wildly, and it's just an inferior product? There's that, I can't remember who the British scientist, but he did the video about, like, if we had nothing but electric vehicles and someone proposed a fossil fuel vehicle, what would the response be? And the response would be, these things are crazy. Like, they're the dumbest invention ever. So, EVs are just sort of top to bottom better. They're cheaper in terms of operational costs. They're cooler, they're faster, they're more efficient. When people ask me what makes me optimistic about the long-term climate-wise, it's that the electrical technologies, the electrotech tech is just better. It's not better because it has more virtue or more morality. It's better because it's better. It's more fun, it's cheaper, it's more powerful, it's all the things we love. So, there's that side of it. And then the sort of the bigotry side of it is, we kind of, the assumption that developing nations will just do what we did, it kind of assumes that they're dumb. It assumes that they won't maximize their self-interest. And if you're a government in Africa, African country, Southeast Asia, why would you pay to import fossil fuels and keep importing fossil fuels when you could just generate your own electricity, which you have ample reserves of solar, probably some decent wind, depending on where you are. Why wouldn't you just grow your own electricity, right? It's rational. It makes sense. It's cheaper. It's better for your economy, rather than having to constantly spend precious foreign currency buying fossil fuels from people. Kingsmill Bond makes the point that there's, more than 150 countries that import fossil fuels, and there's a small handful that export them. Where do you think that clutch of 150 countries, where does their self-interest lie? It lies in not importing fossil fuels anymore. So we should do them the favor of treating them like they're as smart as we are, because they are.
I addressed this in a video not that long ago, and I went and found in Asia, there are 4 countries that have very explicit fossil fuel import substitution policies. We do not want to import any more LNG. We do not want to import any oil for exactly the reasons you said. They have to spend foreign currency. The prices fluctuate. They're volatile. Supply sometimes is volatile. And we're going to burn coal. We're going to deploy wind and solar, whatever it is, but we're going to electrify. Then there were nine other economies, including China, where the policy was implicit. It wasn't stated explicitly, but you can see by the actions that they're taking that they're going to electrify their economy. They're adopting the demand side technologies you talked about. They're increasing coal. They're increasing all of these other wind, solar, and batteries. And China, I'll give you the numbers. Last year, China imported $325 billion of oil and $50 billion of LNG. If that isn't the biggest reason why you would not that you would want to electrify and not import those oil and gas. And by the way, just as a caveat, you don't see anybody in Canada making that argument. I mean, aside from you and me, but it never enters the conversation that there might be, they don't like our product and would actually like to get off it.
Well, it's like, Jason Kenney's famous comment about how, people in India are burning dung and we're going to liberate them from their dung burning ways by sending them glorious Canadian LNG. And like, it's such an arrogant position. Yes, it's good to get people off of burning dung. I don't think they're going to be switching to LNG, which is like, very expensive relative to biomass. But, the point in places like India and elsewhere is the real choice is, do we continue importing fossil fuels or do we start producing more of our own solar? You see this in Pakistan with this massive surge in solar PV installations, not supported by the government, not driven by the government. There's no, it's not like the government said, you must do solar. It was businesses there, households there who were tired of the unreliable grid that they have and the high prices. And they said, I want to get off this grid. I want to make my own electricity. And that realization, that choice is going to be repeated millions and millions and millions of times throughout the developing world. And there's nothing that people in Canada can do to change that. Nothing.
And interesting, when I read Wright's essays, I did a control F. I wanted to find out if he talked about China. In the two essays, he mentioned it once and not in the context that we're talking about it. And the reason that's important, of course, is because China is the first electrostate. It literally leads the world in the manufacture and deployment of anything any of these technologies we're talking about. But more importantly, in the last 2, 3 years, maybe 4 years, it has pivoted down into the global south. And now its exports of those technologies, it's a tsunami into Asia, into Latin America, starting in Africa, etc. And then on top of that, it's also it's companies like BYD and CATL and batteries. They're now they're putting up manufacturing plants or assembly plants. So you get, make it local. And this is all supported by, the state policy like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road Initiative, that sort of thing. And it's as if in Canada, it's as if that process is not happening. We just
Well,
go ahead.
it's because, I mean, look, I think we all struggle to update our priors, as they say, on a regular basis. And so if you're a guy of Wright's vintage, and I don't say that with any disparagement, you are in a similar vintage, I would say, and look at you go. But, like he's probably not checking out the quarterly reports from Ember or from some of these organizations. He probably assumes that China is still growing demand for oil, that is still going to, it is this voracious consumer of commodities that is going to sustain Canada's exports for decades to come, which was the argument as recently as 10 years ago. And it's just not anymore. It's completely the opposite. And these guys are not out there looking for this information that is going to make their long-held beliefs look stupid. They're not good. They're not looking to challenge what they think they know about the world of energy. And I would put a caution for anyone who is reading something about renewable energy. If it has any data from like 2022, 2023, and it's using that to like dunk on renewables, that's a tell, because that data is basically irrelevant now. The world is so much different, even from 2 years ago, on a lot of this stuff in terms of the cost of these technologies, in terms of the way they're being deployed. Like, you really need to be careful about how where your information is coming from and when it was produced, because the time compression here is so intense in terms of how fast these technologies are moving.
Yeah, I would agree. You talk about me being of a certain vintage. Well, I remember the 1990s when we got used to internet time, which sped everything up. Well, now we're on China time, because as an example, if the North American OEM, auto manufacturers want to bring out a new model, it takes them a minimum of 4 years to develop and design it and get it ready for the market. It takes the Chinese companies 18 months. I mean, everything that they do so much faster than we do, and they put so many more resources into it, and they have this enormous innovation ecosystem made up of, I don't know how many engineers, but they've got a lot of engineers, is my point. And the things that they can do we can't do in the West. We're losing that battle against the Chinese for manufacturing supremacy. Well, here's another. I want to talk about one other point that you made, which is that renewables aren't really that cheap. Now, this is Wright's argument, of course, aren't really that cheap once you get the firming costs added in. And I just don't think he has a clue about how modern grids work.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very familiar talking point. Bjorn Lomborg, the is he Is he Norwegian?
Danish.
Danish,
He's Danish.
Danish. Very, he's very popular among people who don't want to believe the transition is happening because he sounds rational, he sounds reasonable. He's kind of the the what would you call it? The perfect model of someone to represent that kind of belief. He's not a climate change denier. He's just a climate change
Skeptic.
skeptic, right? A skeptic, and that sounds great. But like this idea that, well, I don't know if you've heard this or not, but wind and solar don't always work, right? Like, and this is like an old talking point, like, oh, but the sun doesn't always shine, and like again, we all know this. Anyone who's a believer in these technologies, it's not a secret to us that the sun goes down at night. But they bring it out like it's some sort of gotcha. And similarly, they bring out this idea that, well, you might need to use batteries to firm those sources up, and they're very expensive. And it's like, we know that batteries are getting way cheaper. They keep getting cheaper. You need to update your numbers. And so yes, like when you include the firming costs, wind and solar in some cases are not as cheap as certain kinds of gas. But the problem is gas doesn't really get cheaper. Renewables keep getting cheaper all the time, every day. Which horse would you like to bet on? I know which one I would like to bet on. And so, Wright pulls out this chart, sort of claiming to show a correlation between the sort of percentage of wind and solar on a country's grid and home electricity costs. So the more wind and solar you have, the more expensive your utility bills are. This comes from a guy in the States, or it's certainly been popularized by him, who his organization is funded by the Koch Foundation. I think he got money from ExxonMobil. And it's a textbook spurious correlation. So it takes data from mostly European countries from 2023 to 2025, and it purports to show, oh, well, wind and solar, if you have more of that, it's more expensive. That's when natural gas prices in Europe went crazy because Russia invaded Ukraine, and there's that whole fallout. The story there, if you pull all the parts apart, as another gentleman did, I linked to it in my Substack. There's actually no correlation between renewable penetration and home electricity costs. The entire effect is natural gas. That is the entire effect. And we've seen more recent data points out of Texas, noted woke bastion of climate hysteria, and out of Spain, where solar has basically made their grids way more stable and cheaper. And this makes sense because solar, the arc for solar, it produces most of its electricity when people are using most of their electricity. Air conditioning during the summer, appliances in the late afternoon, early evening. It is a perfect fit for the way we use electricity. And so, yeah, you need some batteries to firm it up, and those batteries again keep getting cheaper, keep getting bigger, keep scaling. But you're really kind of giving away the game when you pretend to think that solar can't compete with something like natural gas.
One of the revelations for me is about 2 years ago, I did a podcast interview with a fellow named uh, Gerhard Schlager, and he is the chief technology officer for Hitachi Energy. So not a piker, right?
Hmm.
And a very good engineer, senior engineer. And he said, look, um, you cannot convert the old style centralized hub and spoke power grid that we've been had for 120 years and just plop renewables into it. It doesn't work that way. You need a different type of grid. You need battery storage. You need interties between with other regions. You need to have grid forming inverters to stabilize the voltage and the frequency, on and on and on. He said, but once you make those investments in the different style of grid, you will actually have a lower cost, more robust, more resilient, and more flexible grid than we've ever had. And he said that is the thing that we need going into this new era of electrification. And in Alberta, in particular, because you live in Calgary, and I participate in those Alberta debates all the time, but I see former ASO grid managers making this argument that you can't do that. That's not the way to do it. No, the grid's going to collapse and so on. And I think it shows how far behind we are in some of our thinking.
It does. It also shows the influence of the incumbents in the industry. I mean, they don't want to have to compete with people generating their own solar. They don't want to compete with these new sources of ultra low cost energy. They would like to continue to be able to build natural gas turbines, natural gas generators, and then sell the electricity and have a very sort of simple system that allows them to run their businesses the way they've been run in the past. They don't want disruption. Disruption is hard for them. But we don't exist, or we shouldn't exist, and certainly our politics shouldn't exist to serve the interests of incumbent utilities. With all due respect, they can go get fucked. What matters is having electricity that is affordable, reliable, and sovereign in some respects. I think that's part of why solar has taken off so much in Texas. Part of it is their grid structure. They're basically an island unto themselves. But part of it is Texans, I think, like owning their own shit. They want to be self-sufficient, and putting a solar array on their roof is a great way to do that. I don't really understand why more Albertans haven't sort of cottoned on to that same mindset. I think in a lot of respects, for all the talk in Alberta about us being Texans of the North, we're much more statist and, dare I say, socialist. And I'm referring to my conservative friends here more than anything, but that's a conversation for a whole other interview. But, we don't need to make our electricity policy so that it makes life easy for the NMAXs and the capital powers of the world. They have their own teams, they have their own experts, they'll do just fine. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would have to agree. About 5 years ago, I interviewed a fellow named Val Jensen. And Val was a consultant at that time, but he had been a VP of a utility in Illinois for many years. And he said in the course of, we were talking about the changing power grid and how the utility model was evolving. And he said, Markham, general principle, don't ever, ever let the incumbents dominate the process. He said they will always gatekeep. They will always skew it to their advantage because, for exactly what you said, they don't like change. And then you've got Clay Christensen, the Harvard Business School professor, who made an entire career out of talking about how innovative disruptions come along and they, like a battery or like an EV or a heat pump, and they disrupt the existing business models, and then the incumbent just cannot respond and winds up going bankrupt in most cases. Netflix and Blockbuster would be the
Mhm.
classic example. So we know all of this stuff, and yet here we are in Canada. This is what happens: is we got the oil companies who dominate, we have the utility companies that dominate, the mining companies. Anyway, we're as
Well,
Charlie Angus says, Canada is three oligarchs in a trench coat.
I will turn this back to Alberta politics because that's just sort of my frame of reference for a lot of things. It has been an endless source of frustration for me that the NDP does not have a coherent economic message, as I've told you, and I'm sure many other people. And this is just another issue where it is sitting right there for them. if they had the courage to do it. And the message is that Danielle Smith and UCP, but specifically Danielle Smith, is working for incumbent corporations. That is her most important stakeholder group, is the executives and the shareholders at Suncor, at Capital Power, at what have you. She does their bidding. She is at their behest. And the NDP's solution, their alternative should be, we're going to work for you, right? That doesn't mean we're opposed to capitalism, doesn't mean we're opposed to corporations, but we're going to put in policies that put you first. You, the consumer, you, the small business, you, the 22-year-old in university who's looking for a job. Because the corporations are not out there for you. They do not have your best interests at heart. And I think we're in a moment now where, not a like Avi Lewis style anti-corporate argument, but a more sort of finely tuned, coherent one would find a lot of favor in Alberta because we are getting gouged on any number of fronts. You look at the job losses in the oil and gas sector. They'll want to blame that on Ottawa, but for some reason they have the same job losses in Texas right now in their oil and gas sector. Maybe it's the companies. Maybe it's them replacing people with technology. There's just so many ways in for the NDP here to have an alternative argument, an alternative conversation about how to grow the economy, how to manage the economy. And for some reason, they seem to think the way forward is to be UCP light.
I made exactly that argument in a video last week because you referenced Naheed Nenshi's response to Danielle Smith's comments around pipelines, and it was basically, yeah, well, we like what you're saying. We're just going to do it better because we don't think you're very effective. And I gave, I've held my tongue, held my powder, kept my powder dry, because I thought that Nenshi needed to get his feet under him, and the NDP has historically not had good energy policy. They've been allergic to it almost. And I thought, well, we'll give him a little while to see if he can change the culture. Well, it turned out he's even worse than Notley was, or any other NDP leader. So it's time to train the guns on Naheed Nenshi, and he needs to have his feet held to the fire, because his performance on the energy file, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's electricity, whatever it is, has been abysmal. It really is bad.
Can I make two quick points here?
Yeah, you absolutely can.
So the first one is, in his response, he also tried to suggest that he, as the mayor of Calgary, had some role in TMX getting built, which, come on, man, like, have some self-respect. You didn't, you might have been in the room or at the photo op, but like, it was the federal government that did that work. It had nothing to do with you. The second thing is, and he made this argument a while back, and I think only people like you and me noticed it, but he sort of validated, he gave voice to the argument that, well, we can reduce our emissions by exporting LNG, right? You and I both debunked this argument 1,000 times. It is one of the genuinely dumbest arguments out there. And he's smarter than that. He's supposed to be smarter than that. And so for him to be sort of dumbing the conversation down to the same level as the UCP, again, shows that his vision or his view of energy policy for the NDP is to be UCP light, and it's not going to work.
A little bit of data here. I interviewed an economist in India. She was a utility economist, and we were talking about LNG prices in the Indian or LNG in the Indian power grid. And she made the point. She said, "Look, right now prices are around $9, $10 a million BTU." She said, "To be competitive with coal, it has to be $5.50 a million BTU." She said, I don't think we're ever going to see those prices again. Certainly, the estimates for Canada are like $9.50, $9.75. So the argument that Canadian LNG will displace coal in Asia is absolutely flawed. And furthermore, not one single person has provided evidence that Asia even wants it for that purpose. They've never done it. They just assume it and state it as fact.
Again, it's almost insulting that they make this argument, because it assumes that very sophisticated people working at power utilities in India and China and Indonesia are stupid, right? And they're not. They're not stupid. There's a really interesting argument, a piece written by Javier Blas at Bloomberg, where he talked about how the LNG bridge, which is what they've called it, is basically collapsing right now for the very reason you said, that countries like China and India are looking at this idea of we're going to pay more than coal for LNG. We have to pay to convert, obviously, these facilities. When we could just do coal and solar, we do the solar ourselves, we build it ourselves, we don't have to pay anything to import it. And oh, by the way, we can also get the coal ourselves. We don't have to pay to import that. Why would we buy your LNG when we have a solution here that probably in the aggregate produces lower emissions and is far better as far as energy security goes? And so I would encourage everyone who thinks that the LNG bridge, that these countries are dying to buy our ethical LNG, read Javier Blas's piece in Bloomberg, because you have to give these countries and their leaders credit for being as smart as we are. Because again, they are. They might be smarter, but they're certainly as smart. And if we treat them as though they're two-dimensional pawns whose only job is to buy our commodities, we're going to get real surprised when they outflank us or they do things that are in their interest, not in ours.
Here's a little bit of information you're going to find interesting, Max. The Tim Hodgson, the new Minister of Energy under Prime Minister Mark Carney, is a very, very strong LNG bull. I mean, he talks about it all the time. And so I emailed his department, his media contacts, and I asked them, what energy demand modeling underpins your minister's comments, public comments about LNG demand in Asia and demand for Canadian LNG? And they were very nice. We had some back and forth, and they basically came back and said the IEA steps, which is their business as usual, OPEC, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, all of the U.S. Energy Information Administration, all of the forecasters or agencies, companies that are known to be more pro growth and pro LNG, natural gas and oil. None of the IEA's APS scenario, not Rystad, not on and on and on, the ones that you and I are familiar with. So if you want to know where Tim Hodgson gets his view of the energy future, it's from OPEC. It's from all of these other, modeling reports, which it was no wonder that he and, the business community and so on talk the way they do, because that's what shapes their worldview.
Yeah, it's not great. I think the sort of saving grace here is that the people whose job it is to sanction these huge investments, these huge commitments of capital, are not being guided by politics. They, if it's, whether it's the Shells or the Petronases, like they really do know the numbers. They understand the bear case and the bull case, and they understand that you have to price both of those in. If Canadian LNG is being shipped out of Prince Rupert or Kitimat at $9 per million BTU, like they have to have a lot of certainty that prices aren't going to fall to 6 or 7, because if they do, that's a brutal investment. And so they're going to be really careful. They're not going to be excessively bullish. They're not going to be like, well, of course these countries are going to trade their coal for our wonderful LNG, because at the end of the day, it's business, right? And it sure would be nice if some of our business leaders were a little more willing to moot these arguments and engage them in public. But we don't have a progressive business left in this country. The Americans do. The Americans have, just because, again, richer intellectual culture, more diversity, what have you, but they have people who are both business savvy and sort of are willing to look at things from a different perspective. We really don't. In this country, the progressive left is, I hate to say it, largely financially illiterate, or just opposed to understanding how the economy works, or they're numerically illiterate, and it's not great. And it puts us in this position where, the oil and gas lobby kind of has a free field in which to run their plays, and you end up with this situation where we are not having the conversation we need to have around this stuff. And like this is a big risk to our long-term prosperity. This is not an idle concern. If we get this wrong, if we end up getting bamboozled into making big public bets on LNG, it's going to cost us as citizens in the long run. And maybe that suits people, people in the here and now, executives in the here and now, because hey, we don't have to pay those costs. It'll be our kids or someone else's kids. But we should at least be having that conversation. And it's hard to have it when you have dozens of people lined up on one side and you and me on the other.
One of the things that disturbs me is the lack of discussion of alternatives. So, for example, let's take oil. Danielle Smith wants to build a pipeline out to Prince Rupert or Kitimat at 1 million barrels a day. So I look at that and I go, well, hang on a second. Trans Mountain expansion was 590,000 barrels a day. Now they're talking about expanding, optimizing it for another 200 to 300,000 barrels a day. And we know that dilbit, which is diluted bitumen, requires 20 to 30% diluent. So if you partially upgraded it, if you had all 890,000 barrels a day of capacity available, you could probably not do that pipeline to Prince Rupert. Then on top of that, we know that there are 650,000 barrels a day of shipping capacity in existing pipelines to the US ready to be optimized. There is there are other ways to skin this cat other than building a big expensive pipeline. And it's that being clever and looking outside the box that it's almost impossible to put those kind of ideas into the conversation.
So 2 points. And first point, I made this in a column recently. I don't think Danielle Smith actually wants a pipeline to get built. I think she has proposed this northern pipeline because she knows it will piss off the indigenous leaders up there. She knows it will empower David Eby to oppose it. And then she gets to blame Ottawa. And then she gets to continue distracting her voters from all of the things that she's doing in her province that are raising their cost of living, that are making their lives harder. It is pure politics. Like you say, if she actually wanted to increase oil exports to the BC coast, there are pragmatic technical ways to do it. Ironically, in taking the approach that she has, she may be endangering public support for expansions to TMX, to increasing the number of tankers coming out of the Port of Vancouver. She may be damaging Alberta's oil and gas industry in her supposed attempts to help them. My second point is, well, 2A and 2B. 2A is, if we really want to increase consumption of Canadian barrels, why don't we build a pipeline east? That actually has a valid geopolitical purpose in terms of displacing American imports. Like that you can get Canadians excited about. That's a whole lot, it's a separate conversation. And I think we've had this conversation thousands of times, but nobody is talking about the fact that selling bitumen for consumption is like the lowest value use of that commodity, right? Even Danielle Smith and people in her orbit are willing to accept that at some point demand for oil is going to go down. You and I both know that they're being far too conservative, but at least they accept the concept. And so if we know that, why are we not trying to grow the markets that we know will grow? And that is using bitumen for advanced materials, using it for asphalt, using it for all these purposes that don't involve pipelines, don't get people upset about climate risk because you're not combusting it, and actually offer potentially higher per barrel margins than shipping or ripping and shipping. There's a whole other way to do this that is better on a bunch of fronts, and it's like we just don't want to talk about it. There's a pot of gold sitting outside our front door, and we're like, nah, we're good. We'll leave it there. We don't need to use that. And honestly, it's very frustrating because the conversation doesn't have to be either we build pipelines or Alberta goes broke. It's how do we best want to steward this resource that has value? And there are other ways to do it.
Let me tell you a little anecdote. So I spent 5 years in the industry and mostly working down in the US in Midland, Texas, and then over in Bakersfield, California. I talked to hundreds of oil and gas engineers in that time, all over the place, Wyoming and North Dakota and so on. One of the observations I came away with is that oil and gas engineers are absolutely brilliant at innovating inside the box. The moment you ask them to innovate outside the box, to look at a new technology, a new technique, they don't want to do it. And why would they? Because, if you want to work over a well, it might be $1 million job. If you put something downhole that fails and you have to go back and rework it, you look bad. The company loses money, and you personally, as the engineer, maybe you don't get your bonus. Maybe it's a black mark on your file. So they are extraordinarily risk averse. And the conversation around this issue of can we do other things with the bitumen instead of just doing what we've always done is so reminiscent for me of those conversations I had. They would rather do things more expensively and do them the way they've always done as long as they're making money. When they
Yep.
start losing money, then they get innovative. But otherwise, they'll be inefficient. They'll be do things poorly. As long as they're making money, that's okay. They can live with that.
But this is exactly where government can and should come in. It's not to de-risk a pipeline so that they can continue business as usual. It's to de-risk these technologies that this very risk-averse business, which likes to tell itself that it's very entrepreneurial and swashbuckling, it's to de-risk those technologies that help them grow their market, grow their opportunities, and ultimately make more money, create more jobs. Like it's a known, as Rumsfeld would say, that this is not an industry that likes to take technology risks, that it's careful. And so government can come in there and say, we'll cover you. We will, and obviously, it does this to a very limited extent with Alberta Innovates, but the budget for Alberta Innovates should be increased tenfold, hundredfold. Look, some of the most economically valuable discoveries in human history, I would venture to say almost all of them have started with the government. Whether it's Bell Labs, whether it's the internet, whether it's the oil sands, which, yes, if we remember, was heavily supported by government in its early days. The government is the one that de-risks it, and then the private sector, I mean, they get most of the spoils. I think they should probably be taxed a little more heavily, but that's again another conversation. But that's the game plan: is the government de-risks and then the private sector innovates and deploys. So it should be doing that here. That's what we should be doing, not burning up all of our time and political capital talking about pipelines.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Alberta Innovates because we've been covering the bitumen beyond combustion program since 2017, and I've interviewed the scientists who run it many times. One of the things they've told me is they've said, "Look, Markham, we only get we have a budget of used to be 190 million dollars. Then Kenny cut it down to 150, and then apparently Smith has cut it again." They said we can do. We know, or we're pretty confident that we can do three things: make carbon fiber, make asphalt binder, and make graphite or graphene. We can do those three things. But if we had more resources, so that, like you said, 10 times the budget, suddenly now we can build more facilities, we can hire more scientists, we can do more research. He said there's all kinds of things we could do with bitumen because it has such a unique molecule. Right?
Yeah.
The bitumen molecule is absolutely unique in the hydrocarbon world. It's a sheet. It's not a chain, it's a sheet.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have this, only we and Venezuela have this in the world. And Venezuela is never going to, become a competitor in the materials field.
Mm-hmm.
And we treat it like it's being done off the side of somebody's desk. That's how much
Yeah.
importance we attach to it.
I mean, imagine if Jason Kenney had taken that $1 billion that he used to bet on the American election in 2020 and actually just gave it to Alberta Innovates instead. What would they have been able to do with that? What value economically could they have created from that? I would suggest that it's a multiple, and it's probably a very large multiple. But for some reason, well, not some reason, they don't want to do that because it threatens not just the economic model of the existing oil and gas industry, but the sort of the cultural position of the oil and gas industry. It challenges people who they like and don't want to see challenged. It would disrupt businesses that they would perhaps one day like to work for or have gone to, social functions with. And it's just this whole ecosystem that they don't want to mess with. But it needs to be messed with. If you are working on behalf of the best interests of Albertans and Canadians, we should be trying to solve this puzzle, not just continuing to do the thing that we already know how to do.
On that note, it's a good note to end the interview, Max. It'll be up to you and I will mess with the status quo, with the ecosystem. Thank you
Gladly.
very much. I always enjoy our conversations, and we'll have to get you back again on a more regular basis. Thank you very much for this.
Look forward to it.